NATO foreign ministers meet this week. Preparing for war seems to be top of the agenda. This week, the NATO foreign ministers will meet at NATO headquarters in Brussels from November 27th to the 29th. The objective of the meeting is the war in Ukraine, stability in the Balkans, and preparation for the Washington NATO summit in 2024, where the political leaders of NATO will meet. Sweden, who is awaiting accession into NATO, and the Ukraine will be participating in the meetings this week as well. About a month ago, there were discussions of the war in Ukraine being deadlocked and the needs for peace talks. But the agenda at this week's meetings appears to be not about peace, but preparations for a wider European war. The previous framework discussions for the peace were by the Europeans, and though no consensus was reached, the ideas of a future peace were offered. This week's meetings will be attended by U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Ukrainian officials. The U.S., at least publicly, is hawkish in continuing the war, and the Ukrainians are steadfast that the Russians must leave all Ukrainian territory, including 2014 gains, before peace talks can be held. The Ukrainians' hardline position was given support last week by German Chancellor Olaf Scholz when he stated that the Russians must leave Ukraine territory before peace talks can be held. It is safe to say that this week's meeting will not be a meeting about peace in Ukraine. A German think tank called the German Council on Foreign Relations, the DGAP, released a position paper in November that NATO needs to prepare for war with Russia within 5 to 9 years after peace or the end of large-scale hostilities in Ukraine. The Russians will need to reconstitute its battered army. That will take 6 to 10 years, and NATO needs to be ready for war 1 year prior to Russia can be ready to start a war. The reason that NATO must be ahead of the Russians in preparations is that it will have to reposition forces from west to east and closer to the Russian border. NATO planners led by Germany propose to create what is called a military Schengen zone, and is named after the Schengen zone that allows citizens of the EU to travel to countries within the EU without passports and nearly no border controls. This idea will allow NATO to freely move military units, logistics bases, and stores within NATO without having to negotiate transit with fellow NATO countries. The DGAP policy paper and the discussions about the Schengen zone are aligning to a common objective. The details are still in the works, and presumably NATO will have to get all NATO countries and the European Union to agree to the Schengen zone. The reason why is that this is important is that NATO will have to move eastwardly rapidly once it is determined that the Russian threat is imminent within a year. NATO, since the end of the Cold War, has moved its frontiers about 650 miles closer to Russia, and its borders with Russia have increased from 850 miles when it was mostly the inner German border to be defended to now over 2,500 miles from the Arctic to Turkey. NATO's logistics needs need to be upgraded to support operations that far east and to such an expansive frontier. This is the geographic challenge of a war with Russia that Germany was ill-prepared to handle when it invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. As can be expected, both as a matter of politics and the long-asserted security concerns, Russia has stated that such preparations by NATO will increase tensions between Russia and the West. The concept of being able to freely move and support NATO armies to the east can only be undeniably directed towards Russia and would be an escalatory move against the Russians. A Kremlin spokesman also made a true point that since the end of the Cold War, Russia has not moved westward, but NATO has moved 600 miles closer to Russia. The threat, according to the Russians, is NATO moving closer to Russia. The one factor the Kremlin left out is that Russian military operations in Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine in 2014. So the Russia has also made moves to consolidate its security position as well. Last week, the rhetoric that Russia must leave Ukraine before peace talks can start, the open discussions of a military Schengen zone, and the policy paper that NATO must prepare for a land war with Russia seems to indicate that Russia is further away from peace now than in October. The DGAP policy paper is just an academic exercise and not an official government policy. The Schengen zone, as well, is not new, with discussions starting in 2021 prior to the start of the war in Ukraine. If both are part of NATO planning for a future war with Russia, Why is Europe being so open about their objectives? The Russians have signaled that they cannot coexist with the Ukraine regime and will wage the war for as long as it takes. Is NATO publicly signaling to the Russians that NATO is in it for the long run, and that would include preparing for a war with Russia? The U.S. is hardline to continue the war, but Europe and Russia know that the political realities in the U.S. and falling support for the war in the U.S. Germany and Ukraine have also been hardliners in continuing the war, but they need U.S. support. The reality is that NATO is split politically on continuing the war, but it also knows that it must put a united front against the Russians that is more than just rhetoric. The preparations taken now will give future NATO leaders options against the Russians as well, and NATO can signal to the Russians that it does not want peace. NATO will be prepared for that eventuality. Hopefully this is just part of a chess move in staking out positions for peace.